Hey everyone, it's Lexi and today I'm going to be sharing with you my favorite books of 2015. So the first book that I have is Crest by Miss Amara, and it's the third book in the Remnant Chronicles. And it's by far my favorite in the whole series. I love the characters, I love just kind of like the whole storyline and the relationship between Crest and Thorn and like Thorn and Cinder. This is my favorite. Also because like the character I dislike the most in this series isn't in this one as much, so I think that's also why I really love this as well. The Remnant Chronicles has quickly become one of my favorite series of all time. And also, this next book is the first book that I read in 2015, and it set me off into, it set 2015 off into a good start, and it is Die Again by Tess Gerritsen. Tess Gerritsen is by far probably one of my all-time favorite authors of all time, and she has written the Rizzoli Isles series, and this is the most recent of the Rizzoli Isles series, and it's kind of like almost a then there were none premise, and it deals like the murder is something that took place on an African like safari gone bad, and there was one survivor. So, and it kind of deals with that. So the Rizzoli Isles deal with a case that somehow in Boston that somehow connects to this. A very good series. I just highly recommend if you kind of like the murder mystery that you check this book out, and this was probably close to one of my favorites from the series. So this next book is like a reread that I read this year, but I actually liked it more the second time around, and it is The Queen of the Tearing by Erica Johansson. It's a very more mature kind of fantasy novel that takes place in a future society, but it's regressed. And so like I just really love the character of Kelsey and just her determination, and how even though she's spent basically her whole life preparing to like take her place on the throne, there's still a lot more that she needs to learn, and I'm super excited because there's going to be a movie of this being made with Emma Watson, so I'm super excited as well. So these next two are ones that I've read this year, and they are part of the same series, and I love them equally as much, and they are the Remnant Chronicles by Mary E. Peterson, and the first book is The Kiss of Deception, and the second book is The Heart of Betrayal, and these books blew me away. I was not expecting to love them as much as I did. Like, it's about a girl named Leah who is a princess, and she is basically forced to marry this prince. So on her wedding day, she runs away with her best friend, and the prince and an assassin are sent to go after her and find her. Like, as I said, I was super surprised with how much I love this book. They just keep getting better and better. If you're looking for like a fantasy series to start, I highly recommend that you check these ones out. These were kind of the first ones that like kick-started my fantasy kick this fall. They're just a really good series. I think they were by far kind of my favorite series that I read over the summer. So this next book is one from a series that I started reading in the fall, and it's Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. This is the second book in the Throne of Glass series, and this is by far my favorite of the entire series. I just was blown away by it. I was completely surprised with like the major twist in this novel as well, and it's my favorite. It's not too long. Like the other novels after this just get massive. If you haven't started the Throne of Glass series, I highly recommend that you read this one. You need to push through the first novel, but like once you get to this one, the series just takes off, and it's just amazing. So this next book is one that I read in the beginning of the year, and it is Fireflies Laying by Kristen Hanna, and it's a story about two girls and their friendship that takes place over the course of 30 years, and it's just a beautiful novel. Like, any woman can relate to this book, and it's just beautiful. It's really interesting because it takes place, like, you can see like the trends in like the 70s, the 80s, and like the 90s, and then the early 2000s, and it's just a beautiful story. Like, I highly recommend, even if you don't like contemporary, I feel like this would be a good one because it's one that everyone can relate to, and it's not really like a romance, and it's just about like friendship. And Kristen Hanna quickly has become one of my all-time favorite authors from this year. So the next book that was one of my favorites is Orphan Train by Christina Baker Klein, and this is a historical fiction novel regarding the Orphan Train, which took place in like the early 1920s, and it was like a train that would take orphans out from like the New York and the coast, and it would bring them out to the Midwest where they would try to get adopted. And this tells like the story of two parallels, one that takes place during present day and one that takes place during the Orphan Train. And it's just a beautiful story, and it's just amazing that something like this actually happened. It's a really quick read as well. So like if you're looking for something historical fiction but that's not too frightening like in terms of size, then I highly recommend that you check this one out as well. So the next book that I have is Still Alice by Lisa Genova, and this is a novel that follows the story of Alice, who is a professor at Harvard and one day ends up getting diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, and this just kind of follows her story of like everything leading up to the diagnosis and how her diagnosis affects the people around her and herself, and it shows kind of the continuation of her story as she progresses into this disease. And what's interesting about this, it's kind of written from Alice's perspective, so you can kind of see kind of the confusion that Alice has. I highly recommend that if you have someone who has Alzheimer's in your family, that you check this book out as well, because the author is like a neuroscientist, so everything in here is very accurate in terms of like some of the prognosis and like some of the things that they, like people with this disease go through. So I highly recommend that you check this one out as well. You will definitely plans on killing himself, so she makes it like her goal to make him realize that his life is worth living. And this movie is about to be a movie as well, starring Sam Claflin from The Hunger Games and Matthew Lewis from the Harry Potter series. So I highly recommend that you check this book out. It's very heartbreaking, but it's just a beautiful story, and it has a really deep message in it as well. And so yeah, I highly recommend that you check this one as well. So the next book that I have is a historical fiction novel, and it's What She Left Behind by Ellen Marie Wiseman. And this follows a story, like another parallel story between past and present, but basically the premise of the story is it's about a girl in the 1920s who is kind of rebelling against her parents. She doesn't want to be forced into a marriage, and so they send her into an insane asylum, and it's just her story about like kind of this whole system and how people with mental illnesses were kind of viewed back then and how they were treated. And it's just a very beautiful novel as well, even though it is heartbreaking. And along with Orphan Train, this is probably one of my favorite historical fiction novels. Even if you're not into this like kind of genre, I highly recommend that you check this one out as well. It's just beautiful and one of my favorites. So this next book is one that I've read over the summer, and it is Big Little Lies by Lane Moriarty. And this is another author that I kind of discovered this year, and it tells the story about this little town in Australia, and how in the beginning we know there's a murder. We don't know who was murdered, who was the murderer. It shows kind of like the events leading up to this murder, and how like kind of lies kind of build up into something bigger over time. And it's just a really good novel. It had me on the edge of my seat, and it's just really interesting because it shows you how much like even one little lie can turn into something big. So I highly recommend that you check this one out as well. Okay, so we're down to the last two books, and they're both historical fiction novels. So this one is The Storyteller by Jodi Picoult, and it tells the story of a girl who works in a bakery, and one day she ends up coming across someone who was a Nazi officer during World War II, and how he's kind of like asking forgiveness for all the things that he'd done. But then it also connects with her grandmother, who was a Holocaust survivor, and her story as well, written as like, it felt like it was a real story. Like, that's how good it was. And even though it's very hard to get through, like hard to read some of these things that did happen during this time, it's just a beautiful story about forgiveness, and like, would you forgive someone who put you through all of this? So I highly recommend that you check this one out as well. So this last book is one that I'm sure all of you can guess that it's coming, if you've been watching my channel for a while, and it's The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. And this was probably by far the best book that I've read this year, if not of all time. And for those of you who don't know, it tells the story of two sisters in Nazi-occupied France during World War II, and kind of their two stories. One sister ends up being like a spy for France, helping like the Allied fighter pilots like be smuggled back into Spain, and one other sister is a housewife who has to open her home to a Nazi officer, and kind of her struggle there. And it's just a really interesting story because typically for World War II novels we don't really get that female perspective, and this one did. Like, it was very interesting to see the battle that was fought on home soil, basically, not like on the war front. So it was just a beautiful story. I highly recommend that you check this one out. I guarantee you will not be disappointed. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below what some of your favorite books were this year, and if you've read any of these, what you thought about them. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys!